The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. In early 2025, the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade held a conference titled Building for Growth, Driving Investment in BC's Future, which stated, promoting and championing private sector capital investment in our major projects across BC's economy. The projects the Board of Trade states account for over $230 billion in direct investment, or they could. The day-long event focused on 3 essential steps needed to send a signal to the world that BC is open for business and welcomes investment. The report findings sent a message to both the provincial and federal governments to 1. Create fast and competitive permitting processes. 2. Accelerate Indigenous participation in collaboration with business communities. 3. Develop robust industrial policy that attracts investment to these projects. With the introduction of Bill C-5 federally and Bills 14 and 15 provincially, both levels of government seem to have heard the message and taken steps to speed up permitting. Interestingly, the passage of those bills was done without consultation from First Nations, a move that was quickly downplayed by both levels of government as they reached out to First Nations leaders to work together. The question remains, though, will new policies that attract investment be introduced, and will those measures repair BC and Canada's reputation as being an anti-resource development environment? I invited Susannah Pierce, the past CEO of Shell Canada, who led the LNG Canada Phase I project from concept to implementation, to join me for a conversation that matters about BC's ability to once again attract foreign direct investment to this province. Susannah, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We have a lot to offer in this province, don't we?
We do. Yeah, we have a lot of potential. There's no question about it. And, we're starting to move some gas from that LNG Canada project, which is outstanding.
It's extraordinary. Take me a little bit through the process so that we can understand, these are not easy decisions. And so what goes into the investment, which became $40 billion and probably more, to build Kitimat, the LNG Canada plant? What were the factors that, number 1, attracted the investment, and 2, then how did we get there?
That's a great question, and it's probably going to take a little bit longer to go through it all, so I'll try to keep it somewhat short. But, I think it starts with where are the comparative advantages of British Columbia and Canada? And no question about it, at the time when the joint venture participants were looking at where to put an LNG facility, they saw that Canada had quite a bit of natural gas that needed to be connected to markets and shorter sailing distance to Asia. So right out of the gate, there's an opportunity, I think, for Canada, which is shorter sailing distance to some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Then you had a whole bunch of natural gas reserves that had not been monetized to the extent that they could be in these foreign markets.
Are you talking about Montney Bay?
Yes, yeah.
Or Montney Reserve.
Yeah, the Montney Basin, and it's fantastic. And it's not only fantastic because it's also gas that has a lower carbon content when you actually look at producing it and shipping it. So from that perspective, it's also quite economic, I should add too. So the cost of actually producing that gas is cheaper than it would be in the United States. But that being said, so that's another comparative advantage. But the opportunity for anyone looking to invest was, well, we've got a market over here. We have a potential producing region over here. How do we connect it? One of the disadvantages, of course, Canada had was you have to build these pipelines. You've got to build this infrastructure. The United States already had pipelines in the ground. The United States actually already had LNG facilities. They were importing. Now they're going to export. So from an infrastructure perspective, we were not as competitive. However, when you start to actually look at how do we then design, permit, and build, that's where the conversations with your local communities, First Nations, governments come in. Is this something that you think you might want to entertain? And so a lot of the work right up front was doing that type of engagement. If this was something you're going to entertain, where could it be? What are the best sites? I recall at the time that I think Shell and the other joint venture participant had reviewed more than 400 sites along the coast. That was mostly desktop, and then walking along some of these various different port areas to say, okay, what makes sense? Kitimat was decided upon. And Kitimat, of course, being in the traditional territory of the Haisla, we're able to work directly with the Haisla to develop the plant and a number of the nations sort of further upland and up the channel in order to get the approvals environmentally, their support, and then eventually sitting down with the government and saying, okay, I've got a real project here, but is it ultimately competitive enough to attract a final investment decision? And that's what we're really talking about right now, I think, for BC, which is how competitive are we across all of those considerations? Your environmental permitting, how do we actually then operate this facility, which is also permitting, and cost competitiveness. As I mentioned, from an infrastructure perspective, we had to invest more. So that required more upfront costs, which in the United States it didn't. So how much is it then going to cost to produce this gas? Is there a gap? So when you get to a final investment decision, you're really saying, is it more economic for me to do this here or someplace else?
So what did BC do to demonstrate that it was more economic to do it here?
Yeah. Great question. So at the time, of course, BC had a number of different tax considerations that needed to be addressed. In fact, BC was the only place that had an LNG income tax act. So that was eliminated. This was the only place, I think, in the world that had a specific tax to LNG production income. Now, I think that was during a period of time when there were maybe 9 different proposals, out there. But this was one of those considerations that made it less competitive. You could also look at things like, for example, some of the PST on construction and manufacturing inputs. That was a consideration. The carbon tax was a consideration. So you looked at all these various different things that were disincentives and say, okay, well, how do we structure something that can reduce those overall cost so you can be competitive? So there's a lot of different, I think, levers governments can pull, and they need to look at things, I think, on a project basis. But I've also believed they need to look at things in today's environment more on a consistent basis. Because doing a PST carve out over here for one project is for one project. If we want to create the grounding, or at least the foundation to attract investment, as I'm an individual project, I don't want to have to worry about going into intense negotiations. Why don't you just level the playing field right now in order to attract investment? Say, we're open for business. You don't have to do this different conversation with government. Create the conditions to attract the investments we would like to see. And that's only going to happen if we're competitive with other jurisdictions. And that's going to be on a sector by sector basis ultimately.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Do you think there's an appetite to do that here in British Columbia when you take a look at the current investment climate? I know that we've got the Premier of British Columbia, who's now just announced today that he's going to launch his own anti-tariff ad campaign into the United States. We've got the Prime Minister elbows up, the Premier of Ontario going, we're going to do all these things that we can, but are we actually moving forward to address the real issues that are going to attract that significant foreign direct investment? Because we can't support these projects financially domestically.
Well, that's part of it. I think we're in a very difficult place to put dollars in up front. But I think we have to look at various different fiscal measures that could actually start to generate more revenues once these facilities are actually constructed and producing. And that's something that, again, LNG Canada went through. It is able to actually mitigate some of the upfront costs, but then when they're into operations, they can actually start to pay some of that back. So I think there's some unique things that we can do. I think British Columbia has recognized that we're in a very dire situation as it relates to the potential of these tariff impacts, but even more so just our economy. And we can talk a little bit about how direct investment has not been happening, essentially because some of the tax considerations have not been clear or competitive. We've looked at the regulatory hurdles that a lot of these projects have to go through, that may not actually incent investment. And so I think there's some more things that the government can do. They're doing some of the right things by looking at accelerating permitting, but this has come a little bit too late. And as a result, getting some of these investments across the line is going to take a little bit more time, but I think it's poised in the right direction. I still think there's more that they can do. I still think there's more that the federal government can do, but these come at somewhat of a political cost. And so the question is, are they willing to take some of these potential political hits? It's time for leadership ultimately. And unfortunately, politics can stand in the way of that. But at this point in time, with the risk that we have south of the border, with the fact that we still have an economy which is borderline recession, we have a deficit in debt that is something that we've never seen before. It's going to take time for some really hard conversations and some difficult but important decisions.
So based on the major projects initiative launched by the federal government, do you believe that we are actually starting to move in that direction, or are we still at the rhetoric stage?
No, I think we're actually starting to move in that direction. I think that the task is very large and very difficult, because setting up a major projects management office where you're really trying to look, okay, what would it take to get these projects across the line, I think intentionally is the right thing to do. When it comes down to how do we now actually do that, it's going to require a lot of coordination behind the scenes. Now, is government prepared for that? How do you make sure you're not only doing it for one, but you're doing it for multiple at the same time? That's, I think, the biggest challenge. But I think the intention is absolutely spot on. That's actually how part of the reason why LNG Canada happened, because you had very good coordination between the federal, provincial governments, the proponent, and the Indigenous communities, all collectively. What is it going to take to get this done? Now, the federal government is trying to do that across multiple projects at the same time. So that can create some new challenges, but I think it's the right intentional thing to do.
Well, you in essence wrote the playbook.
We experienced the playbook, yeah.
Because the relationships that you developed with First Nations were in many ways groundbreaking. And they've set an example that says these nations are open to business so long as it's done with the right spirit and integrity and willingness to work together.
That's it. And that's it. And it's candidly, it's something where there's a lot of, over the years, for very obvious reasons, distrust between First Nations, Indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments, for obvious reasons. But at the end of the day, what we experienced and what we led our project was, with all relationships matter, and that you build relationships before you build a project. And that's been used multiple times since then. It's like any deal or negotiation. If you don't trust your counterparty, you're never going to end up with the best deal. But if you can establish a framework of trust where we're actually in it to make each other better, we're actually in it to work through difficult issues, then I think projects can proceed. But it takes a willingness on part of all parties to do that. And I think the LNG Canada's experience was, we created that trust across stakeholders, across First Nations. And as a result of that, again, you were able to attract this very large investment in Canada. It took boots on the ground. It didn't take operating a project from some other office outside of the jurisdiction. You had to be present. It's like anything, any relationship. You need to be present. You need to be willing to have difficult conversations, but know that the end is worth those difficult conversations. And it worked out very well.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. If we take a look at the playbook that was established, and it is so much about the relationship with First Nations. I mean, that is one of the three major points that came out of the Board of Trade's event. We have to make sure that we consolidate, solidify, and move forward building those relationships. Seeing as we have a playbook now, does that help to maybe convince foreign entities that, yes, there is opportunity here, and you do not have to fear that First Nations component of the equation? It's not everything, but it is something that there had been uncertainty around in the past. Can we now say, well, no, we can actually move forward with certainty in our relationship with First Nations?
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of myths that have been out there over the years. And I think a lot of that has now started to fall away. And part of that is just the experience of showing that projects are proceeding, so showing the Indigenous ownership, showing that nations are not necessarily anti-development at all. And so now I believe with foreign investors, that's been demystified. Maybe not everywhere, but I think that's certainly something which we are in a better place today than we were 10 years ago. And again, in 10 years ago, you know, I think industry also needs to take some ownership and accountability for how projects were being approached. And I can speak from experience that I had with conversations about previous projects, you know, and how they did not consult, how they did not engage. So I think we've all learned quite a lot. And I think Canada, as well as a lot of the Indigenous communities who not only are now part of major investments, but are also talking to foreign investors directly themselves. So it's we're definitely in a different space as far as that is concerned. I think attracting capital for these investments continues to be something that from a competitiveness perspective, we need to be mindful about as well. So how do we actually attract the capital to invest in these projects? And that comes down to those first things that we were talking about. What does the fiscal framework look like? What does the regulatory gauntlet look like? How do I have some degree of certainty over time that what I've said these costs are going to be are what they are going to be? How quickly does policy change? You know, an interesting side note, I can remember talking to one of the investors in LNG Canada at the time who was from China. And, you know, I was trying to talk about the stability in Canada from, you know, it's a democracy, it's relatively stable. He said, but you have elections every 4 years. Things can change. You know, things can change automatically from a regulatory position. And you know, you're right, actually. Politically and from a regulatory perspective, things can change, you know, more frequently. So there's a difference of perspective, I think. But as more and more projects get sanctioned and built according to what their original commitments were, and that we begin to see that Canada is a place that is open for business and is going to generate a relationship with foreign countries and countries that are going to pull in our natural resources, things will start to, I think, get better, and we'll start to prove that we are actually a country that's worth investing in.
Well, you're touching on a point that you've made before, and that is about regulatory consistency. Mm-hmm. And we can be consistent in our inconsistency here. Mm-hmm. Since the development of Phase I of LNG Canada, there's been the introduction of Clean BC. Mm-hmm. And that changes the landscape. And how does that then impact a final investment decision on Phase II, for instance? And I know you can't speak for the company at this point, but you're aware of what the impact of these regulatory changes are.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it creates an impact on the overall economics of the project, no question. Anything that will raise costs creates a competitiveness consideration. And so that has to be addressed, you know, through the conversations that LNG Canada would be having with government. Okay, this is what makes us less competitive. Is there anything else that we can do collectively together? And by the way, it's not just on government. I remember at the time with LNG Canada, we also, as a project, had to look at, well, how do we reduce costs? What do we do inside our box in order to make this project more competitive? What can government potentially do to do that? What can our EPC contractor do? You know, our contractors do in terms of reducing costs. So you look at it in all these various different areas of cost reduction to become competitive. And if collectively you can find ways of moving here, reducing here, and getting to that final investment decisions where you're competitive, you've all put some skin in the game. But it's something where any country that you're making an investment in, you need to look out over the life of the project. And it's something ultimately that needs to be managed. And it's not a one and done. You're constantly looking at the overall economics of a project from when you started to when you're operating, and making sure that you're having conversations with governments about how this is going to have an impact. Because at the end of the day, too, governments are also taking royalties and revenues. And that's something that shouldn't be lost either. They want to know that they have a project they can count on because they've done their own economic analysis on this. Is this worth our time? And if it's worth our time, then we also want to make sure that we're not building something that's not going to deliver the revenues that we believe we need to have. That's something that we need to look at right now, particularly in this province. What investments am I attracting so I can count on revenues over the life of a project going decades into the future?
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. One of the elements of the creation of LNG, of course, is the tremendous need for electricity that isn't available out to Kitimat at the moment. And I'm not even convinced that with the new transmission line across the north that it will be enough. And yet built into Clean BC Act is that you have to use hydroelectric generation electricity rather than from natural gas, which of course you would have an abundance of on site. But I note that the Premier's language is changing around that to make accommodations, saying that if the electrical supply isn't there, well, then you can do this. And I bring this up as a point, does that create confusion for the investment community? They go, well, which one is it?
Yeah, it does. Well, anything that creates some degree of uncertainty or change in the future would, and again, so I think that's something where you look at the United States, there's not those types of requirements and
caveats.
Exactly. So I think it does. And all of this gets added up into a risk register. And a risk register will have the specific risk and the potential impact on the overall economic or social supports for the project. So that would get added to it. And then again, as an investor, you're taking risks on. And your risks that you're willing to take on will be related to how much you think that risk will turn out in terms of your opportunity. And yeah, anything that creates uncertainty is a potential issue.
So we're hearing politicians, of course, who are moving towards embracing the idea of these projects. As an investor, do you say, well, I'm happy to hear that, but is that message being heard at the bureaucratic and the level and the application of permitting processes? Yeah. Brad West, the mayor of Coquitlam, isn't convinced that that message is being heard. And do foreign investors pay attention to that? Because that really gets into, well, what are the real details? Yeah. And as they say, the devil's in the details. And if you keep running into that, do you then start to reach a level of frustration where you say, you're saying one thing, but your team is doing something different?
Yeah. I think in the current environment that we're in right now, where there's lots of potential opportunities for BC, one of the things is just the capacity of the government to entertain them all. With LNG Canada Phase I, there was an LNG Canada Secretariat, or an LNG Secretariat set up specifically to help address some of the inefficiencies in how the project would proceed. Setting up a secretariat like that, a major projects management office, same thing, is something where you're trying to funnel a lot of different projects at the same time. So you're actually probably not going to be able to do them all. And there's going to be some who are going to be quite frustrated because they're not getting the response that they'd like. And there'll be others who say, oh yeah, it's all good. So I think it's going to depend project by project. One of the things that I'm mindful about too is it's not only the projects we know today, it's what we're actually doing in terms of creating the foundation to attract projects tomorrow. And those aren't included on that list of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. What they put together is great, but I actually think the number could be quite a lot higher if you consider the number of investors that are looking and say, well, I'd really like to do something there, but I actually am not going to put my neck out or my project company name out until I really know the foundation is set. Mm-hmm. And I see that not just in the energy sector, I see that in other sectors. You know, we have a paucity in industrial land, so we need to address that. I know that there's some issues with respect to how do we attract processing in the agricultural land, ALR, where it doesn't make any sense for farmers not to be able to process food on their own, land. And so there's a whole bunch of different things that I look at. I'm like, well, if we had the availability of more industrial land, would we be able to do more? Would we actually then create more interest? So it's one thing to say that these are individual projects, but just the environment itself, to say that we're actually quite serious, there's some work that could be done there as well. Well,
I'm hoping that it changes. Major Projects Office has put Phase II of the LNG Canada project at the top of its list. It will be interesting to see where we go from here.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see where we go from here. And I will say, being involved in the first decision, these are very important decisions for these companies. They go all the way to the top of the house, all the way to the top of the board, in some case governments, because some of these are government-owned companies. And the world, again, lots of different countries are competing for these investment decisions. But I do think that Canada has a great opportunity in front of us because of the initial things that we talked about, this beautiful basin of natural gas. We know that natural gas is going to continue to be needed. The question is where it's going to come from. Can it come from Canada, British Columbia, or will it come from someplace else?
To be seen.
Yes, to be seen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.